Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Chicago on a drizzly Sunday morning. Last night, the Chicago Bears won a big playoff game against the Packers about half a mile that way, so everyone is in a great mood here at the Chicago Hilton. We're in a good mood because we are here to launch a new book called From Loving to Leaving, or Between Loving and Leaving, Essays on the New Midwestern History. The book was organized and published to commemorate the 10-year anniversary of the founding of the Midwestern History Association and the journal Middle West Review. And we have three of the authors who wrote essays for the volume, which was published by University of Oklahoma Press here today. I'll introduce them in a moment, and we're going to hear commentary by Birk, the president of the Midwestern History Association, who teaches at the University of Tennessee. Our first speaker is Tim Draper, who is a professor of history at Waubonsee Community College in Sugar Grove, Illinois. He received his degrees from Ball State and the University of Iowa and Northern Illinois University. He has published various articles and reviews on religion, urbanism, immigration, the political left, teaching methodology, historiography, and most importantly for us here today, the history of the Midwest. So please welcome Professor Draper.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, John. Also like to acknowledge the Midwest History Association, which has done wonderful work, important work in this field, and I'm proud to be both part of the book project and this panel as well. I was thinking about this and approaching it. One of the things I thought, particularly at this stage in your career as you're kind of winding down, you get a little nostalgic, and I wanted to just talk about four figures that two of them you may know that bridge what I'm going to call are the bookends of the chapter that I wrote for this book, which is regional history and transnational. Two of them came from the University of Wisconsin. The first was Robert Houston, who was Pittsburgh born, but we include him in the Midwest because he hitchhiked from Pittsburgh to Monmouth College, where he got his undergraduate degree. In between two stints in the Navy, he got his master's at Harvard, but then finished off at Wisconsin. I worked with him as an undergrad and grad at Ball State. He was a diplomatic historian. He was also the first history professor I heard swear in class, so it really made an impression on me. But he bridged that idea of the Midwest and this international view, particularly coming out of the Wisconsin school. The other one, John, I think you know, Ellis Hawley, who, outstanding figure. And we think of Ellis Hawley, I think he was Kansas born, was at the University of Iowa. I got to work under him as a graduate student. We think about him as an expert on the associative state. We think about him, his seminal work on the New Deal and monopoly. But in the latter stages of his career, he really focused on Herbert Hoover. And we think about Herbert Hoover as this conservative president, and of course, when we're teaching survey classes, the problems of the Great Depression. But he really was, in the early 20th century, maybe the greatest American international figure. And if you ever go to the Presidential Library, and one of the things Ellis Hawley did was promote the study of Hoover as this kind of transcending figure. The third was my own dissertation advisor, Barbara Posadas, former president of the Immigration and Ethnic History Society. Barbara was born in Chicago. She went to Northwestern, spent her career at Northern Illinois. Her parents were Polish and Filipino immigrants. She was an expert on Illinois history. In fact, was president of the Illinois State Historical Society. She was involved in local history, but she was an immigration and ethnic historian first and foremost. So once again, bridging the regional and the transnational. The final one was, the four I'm mentioning, Barbara's the only one still with us, is Drew Caton. And anyone interested in Midwestern history. I didn't realize at the time as a graduate and undergraduate student at Ball State that Andrew Caton was going to be such a leading force in Midwestern studies as he became. Ohio born, went to Brown, came back to Ball State, went to Miami, and then of course passed away when he shortly after accepting the job at Ohio State. I took colonial history from him, but I also took Latin American history. And as a good colonial Revolutionary War historian, he was an expert in the Atlantic world. What I'm suggesting is looking at these four individuals is that there is an organic link, I think, between the regional and the global or transnational. And I started thinking about this because a little over 10 years ago, I joined a group of 23 other community college historians. Anyone familiar with the AHA knows that Jim, drawing a blank, Jim Grossman, right?
Yep.
Former executive director of the AHA, was always programming. And in accord with the NEH, the AHA developed this Bridging Cultures program. The intent was to take 12 pairs of community college professors and over a 3-year project, learn how to incorporate transnational studies into the undergraduate survey, American survey. We did a year in, wish it had been a year in Huntington Library. It was a week in the Huntington Library about 12 years ago. Then we worked with Bill Deverell of Southern Cal. Next year we went under Phil Morgan at Johns Hopkins at the Smithsonian, then we presented at the AHA. And it got me thinking about transnational history in a new way. The thing as a good Midwesterner that I kept coming back to, however, was we studied at the Huntington Library, and it was fascinating, the Pacific world. The next year on the East Coast, we studied the Atlantic world. You know, looked at whaling, looked at the Caribbean and sugar plantations, indigenous life, obviously, these kinds of things. But I kept coming back is, where's the core? If we're looking truly at the United States or the American experience in a transnational lens, where are we going to go to include the middle? And actually, a little before Bridging Cultures, Midwest History Association had its antecedents and then grew into the organization it is today. And I got involved with it. And I kept thinking, how do we work the two together? And I just want to read you 2 quotes that come from, some of you are familiar with the La Pietra report that the OH did under Thomas Bender at the end of the 20th century. This is transnational history in its perspective. He writes, both the nation and the other historical phenomena we examine must be resituated in target context because the movements of people, money, knowledge, and things are not contained by single political units. The lived and experienced connections in transnational space need to be explored both, the channels that facilitate movement and the ruptures, discontinuities, and disarticulations that structure inequalities and constitute the basis for nations, national and other forms of differentiation. That's their thinking 20 or some years ago that comes out of the La Pietra report. But I want to juxtapose that with what we can see from the MHA, its webpage. The Midwestern History Association is dedicated to developing the field of Midwestern history. The MHA advocates for greater attention to Midwestern history among professional historians, seeks to build the infrastructure necessary for the study of the American Midwest, promotes greater academic discourse relating to Midwestern history, supports the work of the Middle West Review and other journals which promote the study of the Midwest, and offers prizes to scholars who excel in the study of the Midwest. So we have here what are seemingly 2, discordant, if you want, or separate areas of focus. The transnational, how do we go beyond the nation's boundaries and connecting it with the global history? But at the same time, how do we get to this core and understand its place? And what I argued in the chapter that I wrote was that there are connections. There are connections between them. I just want to talk about that a little bit. I think going back as far as Turner, and I talk a little bit about Turnerian historiography, but if we go back to Turner and this idea of evolving, if you want, or moving frontiers, think about the places and spaces and peoples that those frontiers are going through. So at the beginning of this conceptualization of what I would call regional or sectional history that we can trace back to Frederick Jackson Turner, I think is this concept that it's not just one monolithic people. And we all know the problems and the challenges with the Turnerian view coming out of the 19th century. But I think it gives us this kind of framework about one can think. And so what I did in the chapter is I thought, well, what kind of scholarship is going on that connects the region with the nation and the transnational? And I identified 3 areas that I think there's been work done that we can say there's this connection. The first was the colonial Midwest, and of course it went with Richard White's The Middle Ground is one of the books that I mentioned. And you think about and first of all, that's, in a way it's a kind of misnomer, isn't it? The colonial Midwest. Do you have a Midwest before you have the Mexican-American War and California is coming in? And you have a West and an East and a South, now you have a Midwest. But this area past the Appalachian Mountains, west of the Appalachian Mountains, is an area that is a vibrant area for interaction among diverse peoples. You have the French, you have the English, you have the Spanish, and you have indigenous people. As we know, they're not just one indigenous people. You have the Potawatomi, you have the Shawnee, you have, if you're in our state, you have the Illini or Illinois. You have different, we can think about indigenous peoples as part of this transnational factor that we're dealing with. So the colonial one is one that we could do. Then I went with this concept of boundaries and borders, if you will, and mentioned a couple books, The Settler's Empire, Navigating the Inland Sea. But one I'd really like to take, and they're I won't call them dated, they're older. I think they are still useful books. There was a series put out in the 1990s. It may have gone as early as the late 80s into the early 21st century. But it was a Trans-Appalachian Frontier series. And it was edited by two outstanding historians, Walter Nugent and Malcolm Rohrbaugh of the University of Iowa. And I think a couple things are interesting about these. Number one is, from a Midwestern perspective, it's not only transnational as something that you can use, it's trans-regional in a sense, because a Trans-Appalachian Frontier includes, of course, Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, Missouri, but they also include in the series Florida, which obviously is quite outside the province of the Midwest. They have Arkansas, Tennessee, and Kentucky. But it gives us this idea of this area, aside from the original 13 colonies, are part of this historical enterprise of movement of peoples, and not just peoples west, but peoples to the north, to the south, people moving back and forth, and the interaction, particularly of indigenous peoples, who are facing this, migratory, conquering kind of movement of what becomes the United States and state building. But I think this idea of boundaries and borders is something that can be useful. My field is immigration and ethnic history, and I think that is a third area that we can look at. I remember as grad school, one of the things Barbara Posadas had me read, even though I was looking at immigration history in the Desert West, in southwestern Wyoming, was Frederick Blueke's books, particularly that of looking at the Germans on the plains. Obviously, their experience, and I can't speak Norwegian. Is it John Yurdi? That was a brilliant, late John Yurdi, a brilliant scholar, particularly on Scandinavian history. And we know the influx of Norwegian and Swedish immigrants to those regions, particularly to the northern plains and the northern Midwest we see itself. And one that I'd like to acknowledge, and I know Michael Inez Jimenez was at the University of Alabama. I'm not sure if he's still there or not. I knew him through work in the Immigration and Ethnic History Society. Has done quite a bit on looking at Latinos in the Midwest. And the University of Illinois Press has published quite a few books. In fact, I just reviewed one on Puerto Ricans in Illinois. That was more of a sociological study than a historical study. But if we think about the movement of people, we bring the Midwest into this transnational focus. Now, what I'd like to suggest are 4 areas, and there's a multitude of areas that we could look at, but 4 areas where further work can be done. One is missionary work. And 2 things I noticed there. One, once again, going back to the colonial period, the French Jesuits, particularly here in Illinois, but also up into Wisconsin, we know, and into Missouri itself, the French Jesuit presence was very important. I think what's particularly interesting is Latino settlement into urban areas in the Midwest. There was a book, I think it was Catholico Chicago that the University of Illinois Press put out that talked about this concept of Latino identity and immigration and religion. The next one is dear to my heart, agriculture and agribusiness. And part of that is because I live now in DeKalb, Illinois. And DeKalb is responsible for two very important things in terms of international agriculture. One is the development of barbed wire. The other one is the development of a genetics company called DeKalb that became DeKalb Pfizer that eventually was taken over by Monsanto. You talk about a transnational reach. John Deere is another one that one sees that came out of Illinois, particularly out of the Quad Cities. Physics and space studies. My wife, before she became a chemistry professor at Oakton College, worked for probably a dozen years at Fermilab. Fermilab is, before CERN came online, was the particle accelerator in the world. Purdue has a global class aeronautics and aerospace institute and has contributed quite a bit to that field. And then the final one is architecture, and we can see that right here in Chicago. From the Columbian Exposition in 1893 to Frank Lloyd Wright's international appeal to the coming of Mies van der Rohe, who was responsible for designing what became the Illinois Institute of Technology campus, as well as many different buildings. These are areas of inquiry that I think are very focused in what people can do. I'd like to make just a personal note about this connection of the international and the transnational and the regional. My wife and I, my research partner as well, have done a project over the last 2 years of publishing on hiking natural and historic places in Illinois. And when you have that sense of the Midwest connection to the world, all of a sudden you go to the Mississippi Palisades State Park, well, you see acknowledgement of the French presence. Go down to Prairie du Rocher, French settlement dating back to the colonial period. Cahokia not only was a great indigenous people's settlement, it is also one of the oldest Catholic churches in North America, and on and on and on. It gives you an appreciation that we're not just an inland sea, we're part of a greater transnational historical experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. I thought I would take a minute to show off the book here a little bit. University of Oklahoma Press published it. The title, Between Loving and Leaving, came from an essay by Andrew Seal, which is the concluding essay in the book. Andrew teaches at the University of New Hampshire, but he's a Hoosier, he's a native Hoosier, and he talks about the push-pull of the Midwest. Some people love it, they love being here, they celebrate it. Some people want to leave, some people like to stay away, and some people want to return, but he captures all this in the final essay in the book, which I'm sure will interest some of you. Our next speaker is Jason Stacy, who is a professor of history and social science pedagogy at Southern Illinois University down in Edwardsville. He recently published the book Spoon River America, Edgar Lee Masters and the Myth of the American Small Town. That came out from University of Illinois Press. His previous publications include Walt Whitman's Selected Journalism, University of Iowa Press, and Walt Whitman's Multitudes, Labor Reform and Persona in Whitman's Journalism and the First Leaves of Grass. And that came out from Lang in 2008. Please welcome Professor Stacy.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Tim. That was great. I'm a little bit of an interloper in Midwestern history in a lot of ways. First of all, you can tell that a lot of my research is on literature, though I'm trained as a historian, and I approach literature as a primary source and a historical artifact. I'm also a little bit of an interloper in that much of my research agenda of the first half of my career was on Walt Whitman and doing a lot of work on the Northeast, and the market revolution of the 1840s. It's only within the last 5 years or so that I've moved west, and I've moved to the late 19th and early 20th century. I'm going to review what I think are some important historiographical works that speak to an argument I made in the book that John mentioned. And I'm going to spin an argument that's part of that broader research agenda. So we'll see if you buy it. I grew up in a Midwestern town of 1,000 people. It was received opinion among my friends that we needed to get out as quickly as we could. We thought the place was stultifying, though facts on the ground did not prove this so much as the way we interpreted them. From television to film, from popular music to the poetry that my English teacher assigned, outside factors pushed me out the door. Now I live in a small Midwestern city of around 25,000 people. We have a revitalized downtown that aspires to a memory of small-town charm. Main Street is lined with a couple of cafes, quite a few restaurants, boutiques, and resale shops. Even the old barber shop, 2 generations in business, has made the jump from pragmatic necessity to quaint icon. Main Street cultivates wholesomeness, and the city council keeps the big box stores at bay. Behind these 2 versions of the Midwestern town lies a century of history, much of which has been revived by a generation of historians who have sought to counter cliches of insularity and homogeneity. John E. Miller captured an era when Midwestern small towns slid into stereotype after the Second World War, an era when myth seemed more potent than reality. Brent Campney finds a homegrown history of lynching and resistance throughout the region. Kristen Hoganson bucks claims of Midwestern parochialism by discovering that coastal areas had no edge on continental centers when it came to connectivity. John Lauck reminds us that in the 19th and 20th centuries, the region exhibited, of all the developments in modern democracy, the most advanced and most enduring and perhaps the most forgotten. My work takes the historical complexity of the region seriously, but instead of exploring the history of the Midwest as it was, I'm interested in the Midwest as it was perceived, primarily through the myths of Midwestern small towns. By the middle of the last century, Midwestern municipalities had popularly become representative of the nation itself and a synecdoche of the whole. Today I'll sketch 3 broad trends that laid the foundations of the Midwestern small town as representative of the nation at large, though they are hardly exhaustive. This argument draws upon my book, Spoon River America, and seeks to trace the ways popular culture confected economic and social change into a trope, where the Midwestern small town proved normative as a place both wholesomely American and wholly repressive. Unpacking the origins, life cycle, decline, and modern variants of this trope advances an accurate and robust Midwestern history by situating the mythologized Midwestern town within a discrete historical context, thereby undermining the seemingly timelessness of its claims. The first trend was economic. Several factors prepared the Midwest for settlement patterns that gestated the small towns that came to characterize the region. In short, starting with the Land Ordinance of 1785, a grid pattern of 6x6 square mile townships aided the relatively cohesive system of land sales that prefaced the distinctive system of property lines apparent across the Midwest today. The ordinance also required surveying before public sale, which, according to James E. Davis, led to orderly land sales and helped the region escape the squabbling sales that marred other states. By the end of the second decade of the 19th century, the Midwest's structured settlement and relatively thorough removal of native peoples laid the foundation for synergy between town and farm and the illusion that the land had been eternally waiting for white cultivation. With an eye to transparent land sales, Midwestern towns tended to be laid out according to a grid pattern that mapped onto the Land Ordinance. Accordingly, residential housing expanded along lines west of the town's center to take advantage of generally easterly wind patterns. This contributed to residential districts with straight streets that ran perpendicular and parallel to a main street, reserved for businesses and municipal institutions. According to Andrew Caton and Peter Onuf, after the 1830s, proponents of full-blown bourgeois capitalism created towns of shopkeepers, professionals, merchants, and other people of middling rank. After the Civil War, railroads, local banks, grain elevators, and the city of Chicago came to seem for some rural Midwesterners as an aberration on the relatively recent vision of the region as a haven for independent farms and towns. When the value of staple crops fell after production outstripped demand in the 1870s, activist Midwesterner farmers accused economic elites of benefiting from their plight. New financial and transportation networks proved easily reducible to a narrative that pitted hardworking farmers against local town elites and later faraway cities like Chicago and New York. To seek redress with Midwestern farmers in the 1870s organized Granger parties, and by the 1880s state-level alliance parties that won control of state legislatures in anticipation of the Populist Party of the 1890s. A second trend, this one literary, portrayed the region as distinct during this period. Joseph Kirkland, E.W. Howe, and especially Wisconsinite Hamlin Garland characterized Midwestern social structures as often a struggle between agriculturalists and, in Garland's terms, the selfish, monopolistic liars of the towns. In contrast, popular authors like Kansan William Allen White, a sharp critic of populism, portrayed a region of honest settlers, friendly shopkeepers, and charming hijinks in books like The Court of Boyville from 1899. Illinois poet Edgar Lee Masters' best-selling Spoon River Anthology of 1915 drew upon the more populist sentiments and it was influenced by the Imagist poetry in Harriet Monroe's Poetry, a Magazine of Verse, published in Chicago, and it also bridged Midwestern realism, popular audiences, and the nation's literati, helping to export the impression of the Midwestern town's normative exterior underlying pathologies, both economic and psychological. The third trend was intellectual and popularly psychological. 6 years after Spoon River's publication, literary critic and fellow Illinoisan Carl Van Doren repackaged Masters' Spoon River Anthology with other Midwestern authors like Sinclair Lewis and Sherwood Anderson and proclaimed a so-called revolt from the village in the hinterlands. According to Van Doren, the literature of Masters, Anderson, Lewis, and Floyd Dell, among others, exposed Midwestern communities' churning avarice beneath a placid exterior. Midwestern towns for Van Doren were battlefields in a culture war between the modern and the traditional. And while even the authors themselves denied Van Doren's terms, the persistent tradition of a literary revolt against rural communities in the 1920s marked its impact on the evolving popular myth. Scholars for years have questioned Van Doren's characterization of a village revolt, including Barry Gross, David Anderson, John Hallwas, Marcia Noe, and John Lauck, among others. And yet the characterization stuck in popular literary circles and anthologies. In this regard, the mythologization of the Midwestern town and the fantasy of revolt tracked changing norms in middle-class culture beyond the bounds of the Midwest itself. Barry Gross reminds us that the revolt was not against any specific place, but against the myth of the great good place. The Midwestern small town, therefore, according to Gross, stood in for the nation as a place whose claims to be simple and innocent, pure and virtuous, democratic and egalitarian proved fraudulent once they were looked at under the surface. Midwestern origins intellectual trends provided support for this characterization. Freud's visit to the United States in 1909 and the translation of his selected papers on hysteria and other psychoneuroses led, according to Richard Skews, to the transformation of Freud's reputation from a psychotherapist who had adopted a new method to a psychologist with a cohesive body of thought. By 1927, the literary critic Vernon Lewis Parrington characterized middle-class readers as in the unhappy predicament of having their counsel smiled at as the chatter of a generation that knew not Freud. Ultimately then, Freud's theories of repression and neuroses proved polyvalent for popular theories of what ailed most Americans, so that by the 1920s, by the end of the 1920s, a largely urban middle-class cross-section of the reading public opened a discursive space that imagined the rural Midwestern town as the symbolic home of contemporary anxieties, where moral hypocrisy proved to be a manifestation of social neuroses. And so the Midwestern town proved vulnerable to a vulgarized Freudian analysis like Van Doren's, exhibiting anxieties that arose from the repression of its municipal id. According to Van Dorn, after the authors of the Village Revolt published their works, quote, "The roofs and walls were gone, the closets were open, and all the skeletons rattled undenied, and set the most private treasures out for the most public gaze." Even though authors like Masters, Anderson, and Lewis rejected the idea that their work represented a revolt against Midwestern communities, Van Dorn's appellation waxed and waned in popular culture for the rest of the century. In this regard, by the 1920s, a cultural mold had formed, where diverse stories and situations could be made to fit the myth of a repressive municipality that threatened individual self-actualization, a contrast to the treacly myth of Midwestern towns popularized in the early 20th century by authors like William Allen White. Over time, the mold became increasingly regionless, maintaining attributes of its Midwestern origins. White, pseudo-Freudian, dialectical, but applied generally as a narrative trope for explaining complex economic and cultural conflicts, often centered around a blandly normative community and its wise internal exiles, the liberated among the repressed, those in the know and not. As the suburbs expanded over the 20th century, descendants of Van Dorn's critique further expanded the myths, while maintaining a dialectic of the repressed and liberated. Much of the suburban concept of togetherness, formulated by the magazine McCall's in 1954, grew out of an urge for ready-made attributes of Midwestern towns, a kind of updated version of William Allen White's utopian Midwest. Outdoor malls, for example, with the central thoroughfare of shops, emulated the retail district of Midwestern main streets. And Disneyland USA, opened in 1955, solidified the image of the Midwestern town as primarily a retail space that exuded comfortable and timeless charm. Both of these descendants of the Midwestern model, according to Grace Elizabeth Hale, generated a counter-discourse, a romance of the outsider, where white middle-class Americans pitted visions of inviolable identity against supposedly repressive communities. In this romance, suburban and rural communities threatened an indelible personality that struggled for authenticity. Applied in this way, the romance of the outsider by the 1950s fed popular forms of psychology, literature, media, and fashion, since flourishing meant finding one's inner self in the community, or conversely, against the community when it demanded sublimation of the authentic self. But by the 1970s, the Midwestern community had become increasingly difficult to conceive of as a universal home against which to rebel. The fraught years between 1950 and 1970 of activism, legislative progress, urban riots, police violence, and long hot summers accentuated the sheer regionality of the Village Revolt in Midwestern terms. While films like Breaking Away from 1979 or Heathers from 1988 contributed to portray a placid surface that shielded turbulent depths, they also augured a shift in the popular portrayal of small towns in the Midwestern mold, from representative to exotic, surreal, and gothic. Consider Garrison Keillor's radio show, A Prairie Home Companion, one of the longest running examples of the exotic Midwestern town. Keillor portrayed Lake Wobegon, Minnesota as a kind of timeless community of ironic and humorous residents. It spanned 40 years of syndication on National Public Radio and played upon listeners' urge for nostalgic fantasy. Consider also the 2013 film Nebraska, where Woody Grant's life and that of his Nebraska relatives are turned upside down at the prospect of winning a sweepstakes letter, culminating in a story of father-son reconciliation. Conversely, consider films like Fargo of 1996 or Three Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri in 2017, which portrayed their respective communities as insular and novel, where a murder mystery is wrapped in the mores of the community. In the case of Fargo, the overweening niceness of the upper Midwest. In the case of Three Billboards, the turgid conformity and latent violence of small towns in the lower Midwest. This narrative, or consider the narrative conceit of the Netflix series Ozark, likewise depending upon the juxtaposition between suburbanites and colorful locals around them. The Midwestern town also took a turn for the surreal and the Gothic by the late 20th century. John Carpenter's Halloween from 1978 depended upon the juxtaposition of sedate Haddonfield, Illinois, with the serial killer who terrorized it, and the more sentimental but nonetheless surreal Field of Dreams of 1989 takes place in rural Iowa, where the ghosts of the Chicago Black Sox inspire a middle-aged son to build a baseball field in his father's honor. Other examples include The Messenger from 2007, where a Chicago family moves to rural North Dakota, an isolated farmhouse, which is haunted by ghosts of the murdered previous residents, and the Netflix series Stranger Things, which portrays Hawkins, Indiana as afflicted by a sinister alternative dimension and exploitation by a hidden government lab. Popular portrayals of the Midwest have served many purposes over the last 100 years, none of which has proved particularly useful to the region itself. From a representative but contested place, where conceptions of the traditional and modern, the individual and the community struggled to lay claim even beyond the region itself, to a place where localism abided and the supernatural emerged from the woods or fields, the Midwestern town is often portrayed as a place where a pleasant surface hides unplumbed depths. Recently, HBO's Somebody Somewhere follows Sam as she returns to Manhattan, Kansas to engage in an ambivalent love affair with her hometown, inverting long-standing tropes of repression with self-actualization through homecoming, where Sam discovers the town's weirdos are her closest kin. Recent research, like Julianne Couch's The Small Town Midwest, Resilience and Hope in the 21st Century, and John Lauck's The Good Country, reject these well-worn tropes. And so perhaps it is time to move on from the myth of the Midwestern small town as representative, for better or for worse, and consequently reject the idea that it is a place for revolt or self-discovery, a cage or a refuge. Our towns are instead actual places, no more or less representative of contemporary cultural anxieties or nostalgia than anywhere else. Thanks.
Thanks, Jason. I just wanted to say a couple more words about the book. Again, here's the cover. University of Oklahoma Press chose an image from the 1880s by the artist Sally Cover. Maybe our next speaker, art historian Jason Weems, can talk about her a little bit. Maybe he's heard about her. But I also wanted to say a little bit more about some of the other essays. There's 3 essays on the African American experience in the Midwest, another chapter on the Latino Midwest by Emiliano Aguilar of University of Notre Dame. There are essays about geography and the environmental history of the region, and another literature chapter, of course, a chapter about farming, chapter about Native Americans. So please check it out. University of Oklahoma Press did a wonderful job with the book, so we want to acknowledge that. Our next speaker is Jason Weems, who is a professor of American art and visual culture at the University of California, Riverside. He is the author of the book Barnstorming the Prairies, How Aerial Vision Shaped the Midwest, from University of Minnesota Press in 2015. I remember very well when that book came out, and it, I believe, was the first winner of the annual book prize of the Midwestern History Association, the John Jurdy Prize. John Jurdy's name was mentioned earlier here by Tim. Jason's current research includes investigations of archaeological illustration in the Americas, photography of and by Native Americans during the New Deal era, and tropes of soil and land connectedness in U.S. art and culture. Jason was born on and raised on a farm in Iowa. Please welcome Jason.